Hi, here's Alex from the Siebel Hub with the second part of our blacksheep CRM devpops extravaganza. So in this second part, we're going to do a deep dive, and I'm narrating live to the source code of devpops. So if you're new to devpops, you don't know what devpops is, make sure you watch the first video in this series. You find the link in the description. And if you're already familiar with devpops, but you have no regular Siebel Open UI knowledge, then I strongly recommend that you consider taking the Siebel Hub Open UI Basics and the Siebel Hub Open UI Professional Training. Both are fully recorded. That is, they are available for self-study at a very reasonable price. You can, of course, give us a call anytime. We arrange a call to identify your exact training needs. But if you scroll down on the pages and you find the link in your video description, you see the modules for the Siebel Open UI Basics training in the list, and you can click the links and go directly to purchase the video training. The same is true for the Open UI Professional class. And devpops, as we will see it in the next hour or so, is a application that is written using the Siebel Open UI framework, but also with a lot of background on Siebel CRM. So make sure you're really comfortable with the concepts of Siebel CRM, business services, REST API, and devpops, or let yourself get inspired a little to learn more. So having said that, you can find the devpops source code at any time on GitHub. The link is in the description. And so what are the technical contents of devpops? So let's go right through the list here. So there's an XML file, which is a client-side business service. So as you know, in Siebel, there can be repository-defined business services, which should be the norm. And business services can also be defined in the client that is outside of the repository. And they're not managed by workspaces, so that's really something different. But in devpops, we use this option to have something that is quickly editable and manageable, because devpops is not actually run in any mission-critical environment. It's there for learning. So that's a business service you can import into the Siebel client. And that business service, of course, must be registered with the application. Now that's the license. devpops is under MIT license, so no strings attached, no support. You use it at your own peril. There's the README file. We'll look at it in a second. There's a third-party file from a contributor to devpops, Xapuk. And that's the main JavaScript file. We will work mostly with the main JavaScript file, devpops.js, and postload.js, which is, as you might imagine, the extension of the standard postload.js file, which we will discuss in a moment why we do this. Then there's a ZIF file with various repository objects that devpops requires, such as business services, integration objects, views, and applets. And then there are two PDF files, the developer guide and the user guide. That V file here is just a version file, indicating the version number of devpops. So the README is mandatory literature. Make sure you understand that devpops is strictly educational for your inspiration, for learning, not for use in any mission-critical environments. Followed by the links to the user guide and developer guide, which you can download, and a description of what's new in the latest release. And all these features are explained in the first video. So if you're interested in the X-ray data export, the sitemap, or any other of the, well, incredible features that are built into devpops, just using Siebel Open UI and Siebel REST and business services, you can marvel at the first video. Link is in the description. So let's go beyond the feature list, which is impressive. And here's the installation. So in case you want to install devpops on a Pathfinder sandbox environment of your choice or training environment, you have to follow these steps, which are basic Siebel steps, should be understood by everybody who is technically well versed with Siebel CRM, like importing ZIP files, registering views, registering business services, delivering repository changes, copying JavaScript files, OpenUI manifest, and so forth. So as you notice, we have regarded JavaScript, and the main part of this will be JavaScript. We have copied the code from postload.js to the vanilla postload.js function. So you would ask, and very rightfully so you would ask, why would you modify a vanilla file? It's actually not supported by Oracle. The reason we do this is we want to showcase modification enhancements to Siebel Web Tools, which is a Siebel web application using Siebel Open UI, but it uses the safe boot options. So it uses only the vanilla manifest and the vanilla repository. So to inject any JavaScript code into Web Tools, we have to, well, kind of hack into the vanilla files. And the best place we found is the postload file, which is a sample file, so to speak. It does nothing much, and there's plenty of space to place code there. Of course, if you do a Siebel update, you have to repeat that effort every time, and that's why devpops is not intended for any mission-critical environment. But still, if you do that, if you copy that code to your vanilla postload.js file, you enable devpops and you enable the Web Tools enhancements. And then there's the devpops.js file, which has all the rest of the JavaScript code, really, that we will discuss. And the devpops.js file must be registered in the manifest with platform independent application common. That means it's loaded with the application, so not specific to any applet or view. Alrighty, so there's a postload file. We know what postload files do. They establish postload event listeners. So let's dive right into the postload.js file that comes with devpops. And we are at the very end of the file. So if we scroll up all the way, we find the vanilla postload content. It's there for reference, so people don't override it. The vanilla content really doesn't do any harm if it's not there. It establishes a sample listener, which doesn't do anything. So you could live well without that code, but leave it here. And then there's the blacksheep code that comes below the vanilla code. So let's go down again. And because at the end of the file, there's something, the code that runs when the file is loaded. So there's a try block there to stay safe. And so we look for Web Tools in the URL. And only if Web Tools isn't the URL, we add a listener, a postload listener, and there's the function here that's called. And the function is right above that. So this happens when you log into Siebel Web Tools. It's a postload listener, so it runs every time you load a view in Web Tools. Keep that in mind. So again, we check for the application name, making sure it's Siebel Web Tools and not anything else. And then we actually call the first function, the Web Tools enhancer, and we call several other functions. So if there's a very specific view, the screen view, list view, we call another function. And in any other view, including the one we add screen menu, set tools help content, and prettify banner. So this is a pattern that I have personally adopted for making changes to the overall application using the postload event listener, something that is called every time a view is loaded. Can be very beneficial, as you can refresh stuff very easily. And also you using the functions here, it's very easy to read. So what happens, there are functions called, and the complex code is of course inside that functions. And when you apply this technique in postload event listeners, make sure you do not really make any outbound calls from the browser or into Siebel, like business services or REST calls, anything that takes longer than a few milliseconds. So most JavaScript is fine because the browser processes JavaScript really fast. A few milliseconds here and there, adding up to maybe 100 or 200 milliseconds. Users will barely notice the difference and get a lot of benefits in exchange. But once you start calling, especially synchronously, business services or REST APIs, then of course you get in trouble, especially if you loop for each applet or whatever, or for each button, call something. That's a very bad idea in a postload event listener, and you should not do it. You should actually use asynchronous calls or wait until the user clicks on a button and then make the call. So here at most we establish buttons that the user can click or menus. So let's take a look. The first video, we've seen several things in Siebel Web Tools, and let me just briefly explain, for example, the Web Tools features that are included in this Web Tool enhancer. So you see the feature first quickly. You can always go back and watch the first video, but let's briefly revisit that. And I will use the devpops user guide to do that. So bear with me. There we go. So one of the features that is introduced in devpops is the Web Tools Whodunnit, and that means a developer can see which object has been or is currently modified by himself, or other developers, and it sees which workspace and version. So that is the enhancement of Web Tools that we talk about. Okay, so let's look at that Web Tools enhancer function. There it is. It's a very small function. So it actually grabs the main list applet PM. So the usually if you navigate to like applet or application view, you have one big list applet. So we grab the presentation model of that one, and we attach at show selections, we attach another function, and we call that function. That function takes the PM. Now, there's another pattern I use a lot. When a function is not specific, like a physical renderer or presentation model extension, but still requires the context of an applet, you pass that context to the function. And the PM is a perfect context, let's say, because from the PM you can reach anything if you need. You can reach the renderer, you can reach the data model, you can reach the record set, the control set. So I'm passing the PM to this function. And let's take a look. There's the function, the highlight function. So we're not going to go into too many details. So you see that validating the PM. And then if we really have a presentation model as the context, we grab the current object type actually from what is selected in the Object Explorer in Web Tools. So if you select application or applet, you have the object type. And here's a pattern that you will see repeated a lot. So we get the full ID of the applet. We get the placeholder, just in case. It's a list applet, after all. And we get the applet element using the full ID. Remember, the applet DOM element has a distinct ID, and so we can stay inside the applet with any user interface modifications using that AE variable. Then we get the raw record set. And so now we parse the record set. For each record, we, well, create an object here which carries the name of the repository object. So let's say the name of the business service, and identifies the cell, actually the writable cell, which is the first column, the writable column in the applet, and establishes a click event handler. And on clicking that row, the entire row actually, we will modify the cell and pass it to another function. So the cell is, what you can see here in the screenshot, is the orange part. So that is after the code has run. So the clicking on the row will get the current workspace data. Now it gets interesting because we not only paint the cell amber or orange and place some icons there, it's real data from the Siebel database. And we're inside Web Tools, we cannot run any custom code. So how do we do this? So there's a function, get a workspace, get modified data, and we pass in the writable cell to it, so it will modify that. So let's get to that function. So we have written the object type and repository name to the cell, so we can retrieve it from there. And here you see something that you might recognize. We're preparing a call to the Siebel inbound REST API. Now that's the trick. Siebel Web Tools cannot run any custom business service because it runs on the vanilla repository in safe mode. It cannot use a custom integration object, etc. So we have a custom integration object for the REST API using the data API. So there's BCRM modified object. And of course, we should pay a visit to that. So let's get into Web Tools. And let's also see the feature in action. So that is a nice opportunity to do that. Okay, so for the purpose of testing, so I know devpops is running because I see a pretty redwood-inspired banner background that moves, and that's very pretty. So for the purpose of testing, I will create a demo workspace. And open it. So when it's created, it's opened. And now I will go to business service. So remember what the code does. It has a show selection. So the postload establishes a show selection handler on the big list applet. So if we change the view to business service, the postload runs. And now show selection handler calls that function. And so in that writable column, there should be already some modifications, but let's query for a business service that I use for demos frequently, Eliza, and let me click the row. You see what happens? There, the code kicks in, and I see that 3 people, or could be the same people, but in 3 different workspaces, this object has already been modified. So that's the feature. It's a modification of Web Tools that shows who done it. All right. For this one, doesn't show anything. So that's no data is retrieved. All right. So how's the data retrieved actually? A REST call is made. So REST call using the data API requires an integration object starting with base. So let's get to integration object and query for base BCRM. That's blacksheep CRM. And there is indeed a BCRM modified object. So that's the name of a business object that's exposed by the data API. If you know about the REST API, and again, the Siebel Hub training can help you understand that, to use the data API, you need an integration object that starts with base, space, and then the name of the business object. So that exposes the data. Okay, let's take a look at that business object. So why can we use the REST API and not a standard business, not a custom business service? We cannot use a custom business service because Web Tools wouldn't recognize it. But the browser can make a REST call to anywhere, including the Siebel REST API, and that uses the EAI object manager, which runs on the custom repository, and that's the trick. That's how it works. Okay, that new business object that is part of the CIF file delivered with devpops. Let's see, it has some business components. So it shows modified objects, merge object and merge attributes. So the parent business component is BCRM modified object. And let's take a closer look. BCRM modified object business component is built on top of, well, a standard table. So it's a custom business component, but it's built on top of a standard table called sRTC modification object, mod object. Now, the business component, of course, is required to access the data. And as you can see, it's a link to two other child business components, has several fields like the object name, workspace, editable flag, and so on. So that data is residing in standard tables. There's no custom table involved in the Siebel database. So this business component and its children are exposing that data. And if you look at the application extension of devpops, let's quickly log into the application. There's also a applets and view has been built and provided in the CIF file. So if you have devpops running and you have imported the CIF file and registered the view, you have a custom view which you can just access through the devpops menu. Go to modified objects view. And so that's the exact data. So you can see the business service ELISA being currently edited by dev2 and dev1 user in their respective workspace and version. So the REST call retrieves that data as a JSON file, JSON string, JSON object. So here we prepare the REST call, and it's an asynchronous call by default. And we have a done function. So once the call comes back, there's a callback function. And so removes all the avatars in the cell and create for each record, create an avatar, which is the circle thing, and which tells on hover, tells the username and the workspace name, etc. And we also change the background. So another thing you should know about devpops is that it's very, well, straightforward implementation, and for several reasons it does not use any custom style sheet. Now, you would say that's very bad style, and yes, I agree. And if you do this in the real world, you would probably have a proper style sheet registered and put all the styles in the style sheet and refer to classes with the custom HTML. So jQuery is used to create the overlay, let's say, or the insert into that writable column with the avatars. And that's, so the function retrieves the current data for the respective object and then creates the overlay. Okay, and we have discovered well, several patterns, Open UI strategies, so to speak, such as using postload and calling a function and getting data from Siebel using the REST API, or it could, instead of the REST API, of course, you could have a business service call. But being web tools, it's not possible to do that with a custom business service and custom integration objects, etc. So we resort to the REST API, and it's a nice use case for, well, if need be, you can always call the REST API of Siebel. But the penalty is that it takes longer to call the REST API than an internal business service. But there might be benefits, such as you run in a separate object manager. That could be a good thing. Okay, so we have seen several functions in action, the Web Tools enhancer functions. Let's go back to the post load. So Web Tools enhancer enables that functionality that we have just witnessed. Let's not talk too much about that button on the screen view list for screen. Please refer to the first video to see how that works. But here's another function I would like to discuss is add screen menu, because it shows how to, well, create additional menus in an application that are not defined. And Web Tools, and again, you can't customize this. So how do you add custom menus to Web Tools? So what menu we're talking about real quick? This menu, screens. We create this from scratch using JavaScript, and it allows you to access the screens that are defined for Siebel Web Tools. And you can imagine, of course, anything in that menu depending on what you want to implement. So let's look it up. So this is a function that mostly deals with the creation of the menu. So, and remember, it runs every time a view is loaded. So if you have to do this, so you have to check if the stuff you create already exists, and if it doesn't exist, like the length of the, let's call it jQuery object, is 0, so it doesn't exist, then you create it. And if it already exists, you don't need to create it, right? So that's the main LI. So the main LI element, and that's appended to the UI menu bar. So that's all jQuery work. And there's a mouse over, mouse out to mimic the standard behavior of a menu. Okay, and now there's a click event handler, and the main function is vcrm create screen menu. Let's find that one. So that function creates the whole menu, so it has to iterate through a set of data that we retrieve using, well, you guess it, REST API again. So, and of course that data in the menu could be retrieved from anywhere, could be hard-coded. So here we have the UL, the unnumbered list, and our task is to create a lot of LIs, list items that are then part of the menu. So to get the data, in this case screens, we have a function get application screens, and we pass in the name of the application. So keep your code generic. Now let's quickly go to that function, get app screens. Okay, and we can already see there's preparation being done to get data, in this case from the main workspace for the application object. So that means the application object in the main workspace. And in case of Siebel Web Tools or any other application, would retrieve the screen menu items, really. Yes. And that response is then, well, a bit parsed and modified and returned. Okay, so we can go back to the actual call. And there's the recent view behavior here. Well, for the recent views, there's another thing we have to discuss is how devpops stores data. Because when a user uses recent views, I'll show you what this means. So here's a recent views section. That's not a screen. That's a custom section in the menu, but it shows the views the user has recently accessed. And that means that is user-specific stuff. It needs to be stored somewhere. And we discussed this in the first video as well. It could be user preferences, but that's a bit complicated, especially when you're outside of an applet. And we have in devpops, we have separate storage, and we have a getter and setter function for the devpops storage. And you notice the call to get the storage items for the recently used views uses the current username as a prefix to a storage item name. And if it doesn't receive anything, that's fine. But if there's something received, the recent views are populated. And then we parse the screens array that we have received here. We create the LIs for each screen. That's how the menu comes to life. And it's a bit complicated, but there's a lot of code here. And there's also when you, for example, when you click an item, there's a set storage item function which saves the recent views, because as you use the screens menu, click views, you want to save them in the recent views. So let's take a look at that storage. To actually look at the storage, we can go to the application devpops menu, devpops storage, which is navigating to a view that you might know. It's in the administration business service screen. Now, devpops does a lot of weird stuff. Now, that's not a business service. You say rightfully so. That's JSON. So we're using hijacking. You could say we're hijacking. Let's call it by the name. We're hijacking the code column in the client-side business service table. Now, is that safe or not? It's probably not, but it's not intended for mission-critical systems, and all these scripts basically are then marked as inactive. So they're not relevant to any application. And also being inside that non-repository table, probably never migrated to anywhere. How do we access them? We could have a business service or business component call, but REST APIs has to be used from Web Tools for known reasons. So we have a integration object on top of that. We should actually see it. The BCRM devpops storage. So there's a business object with an integration object, and we can make REST calls to, well, read or write to this. And you see the external name context really uses the business service script component. So the business object is basically a copy of the business object behind the client-side business services. So don't try this at home. You probably want to create a custom table with a long or a character large object column. It has to, well, carry some JSON, and we use it in various places in devpops, and the recent views for web tools are just right here. So recognize that username prefix, so user specific entry and Web Tools recent views. Let's pretty print that. And that's the two views we see currently. So let's go to the screens menu in Web Tools. Let's open another view, like Business Service Access. And yes, that is very strange. If you have seen it for the first time, probably scared. Web Tools has screens. As of this recording, version 22.2, Web Tools has screens, and screens have views, and Web Tools is just your regular Siebel web application, so you can open views, right? So might sound strange, but it's just Siebel application logic. So now we have access to view, and in the recent views, it's already entered. There's a third one now. So what happened to this record? It has been modified by another user, so the pretty print tried to modify it. So that's good. And the pretty print again, and now we see, yeah, the new view has been added to the JSON. So that's what the JavaScript does. The JavaScript makes the setter call that uses the REST API to store that data. And then Siebel Web Tools uses the REST API again to get that data when needed. So storing this kind of data inside the Siebel database is probably a good idea, because Siebel database is big enough and can hold anything. And you can build very easily, you can build an infrastructure on top of that to support getter and setter functionality using a business service, using integration objects or the REST API. So that's what we want to showcase here, really. We don't want to showcase, hey, you can customize the hell out of Web Tools, but we want to showcase you can create something that looks like a menu to the user and shows data that can handle clicks and does something, and even can store user-specific options or configurations in a meaningful way, and you can retrieve it from anywhere using a business service or a REST call, respectively. So that's what it's all about. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of insight how devpops works. So let's see if we can do, yeah. So that's the two main things I would like to show you about Web Tools. And that's it for, well, most of the postload stuff. There's not enough time really to go through each and every function. So there's a lot of functions in the postload source code. And for example, supporting the REST calls, etc. And many of these functions are also used by the application. But most of the application code is in devpops.js. So that's really a custom JavaScript file. And it's very big, because we have crammed over the years a lot of stuff in there. But it's driven in the same way. It's driven by a postload listener. So let's see what listeners are defined in this file. So there's a postload listener, not limited to any application. So it runs, but Web Tools doesn't recognize this file, so Web Tools doesn't run it, but any other application runs it. And if you copy your own, create your own copy of devpops, you can change this. You can just limit it to several applications, etc. There's another listener, actually for app_init. Now, this is not really documented, but app_init runs only when the application starts, only once. And there's one function we call the get workspace context. Now, and you see there's a call to web engine client preferences, so something really like clandestine we do. But devpops needs to be aware of the current open workspace in the application to show that information, also use that information internally. So quick demo is in order. As you notice, when devpops is engaged, the workspace and version is always shown on top of of the application. That's not standard. So that's what the app init is all about. So let's focus on the other postload event listener. There's a, well, helper function, and that helper function is here. It's a little bit bigger, but it's the same pattern. We try to keep it small, keep it simple, and call other functions that do the main work. So here, some very few specific stuff. The modified object list view that we have already seen uses a third-party plugin, and if for any reason you don't want to download that plugin, you could, of course, and register in the manifest, but we want to download it dynamically from the CDN. So we just inject a link and a script element into the header, if it doesn't exist. So the browser will then actually load these files. So Mergely is the third-party plugin that is used for that specific view. And you can see that only in that view there's a show selection. And we don't really go into that here. And then there's some general stuff. So we make sure it's not running in Web Tools, and only if that Sieb Composer config button exists, that is actually the workspace icon, the cube icon. So that is kind of piggybacking on the responsibility that is behind this icon. So only users with access to the workspace dashboard really get to use devpops and nobody else. And of course you can change this in your implementation. So here we have an icon enhancer, we add the debug button, we apply some defaults. And one of the main things in devpops that happen is it establishes a custom button. We just use the debug icon from Oracle here, but that's a opening custom menu, the devpops menu, the main menu, and also it establishes a right click on the workspace icon. And that right click allows you to use the Fast Inspect feature. But for a demo of that, please refer to the first video in this series. So again, we're enhancing an application based on a postload listener. So we must make sure the code is stable enough. So when it runs several times per session, it should not create multiple buttons. And this is a quite a big customizable menu. And of course, it's a little bit, let's say, over the top for regular users, like it can be converted to a toolbar, or it has some customizing features. You can select individual icons. You could imagine dragging, dropping them around. So really personalizable menu with some extras like a options button, in this case for silent mode, X-ray silent mode, or these toggle buttons to enable a feature permanently. Again, it's all shown in the first video. So if you're interested in how to build that menu, you can of course check out the code. So the icon enhancer function is what's behind that menu. So correction here, the icon enhancer is actually the dashboard icon, sorry. So the dashboard icon right click is implemented here. And this is the right click handler. Right click translates in jQuery in context menu, and here we can see the get workspace list that gets the data that is then displayed in that dynamic drop down or menu that you see. So let's check it out. Just curious, how do we get the workspace list? And well, it's REST API, again, using that BCRM modified object, business object that we have seen before. So we're reusing that here to get the list of recently used workspaces. So that's the right-click handler. Let's go back to the listener. And there's the debug button. So that's the second menu. It creates the button, and of course, clicking the button will open that big menu. So let's check out that function. So here you see next to is a variable, and we choose the composer config. That's the dashboard button. And again, we verify that if the button does not already exist, we inject some CSS. Remember, we don't use CSS style sheets, so we want the browser to have some, well, fancy style rules loaded. We have create a style, inline style, and we inject it into the header. So that's a very questionable strategy. Custom style sheet would be much better, but for the sake of simplicity, so to speak, the simplicity of focusing on the JavaScript side, we just have inline CSS here. Not the best choice in hindsight, but that's the way it is. And you can do better. So here's the button itself. And there's the button LI. So the button has inside a UL, a unnumbered list, and that's a first LI. And then there is a main function to create the menu proper, which is then turned into the whole thing that you see. So that create debug menu. So here's the create debug menu function. And you see that here is a very big variable, BCRM menu. So it's initialized global variable, initialized empty. And basically we check if the first item is not defined. We just declare the variable, and it's a big JSON object. And for each menu item, we have an item here defined with a sequence of 1, 2, 3, and so forth, whether it's enabled or not. A label which is shown to the user, a title which is in the tooltip, and an on-click callback function. What happens when you click it? Because different things happen. View navigation, opening a dialog box, and so forth, or calling another function. So, and then show a toggle or not. Remember those toggle items and what image should be displayed in case it's a toolbar. So this is a concept. We could well store this in the devpops storage, but there's another way of doing it, storing it as a JSON object. Could be a separate file, maybe a better idea, but it has grown here right in their function. So you see all the items in the menu have a declarative, if you will, definition. And so that variable is then used later on. Bear with me, very big one. So that's all the menu definition that you see here. And at the end, after that menu definition, it calls a customized debug menu function where the customer using devpops could insert other menu items like this into the big variable. And let's see. So there's all the buttons on the top menu, but here there it is for item in BCR menu. So that's where we take this big variable with all these 20 plus items, and for each item we create an li, and we create a div, and we have a title, and we dynamically enable, disable it, and we establish the click event handler as basically whatever is defined in the onClick property. So that must be a function, of course. So you see here the template code of the menu is turned into the real clickable thingy. And there are some specifics here with even access control is implemented here. So some menu items might be restricted by responsibilities. Yes, that's possible too. And some special behaviors here. So that's a very big function because a lot of special behavior is there, including something for timing reasons. I will not go into too much detail. If you look at the menu, some items have an options dialog, like the start SARM. And that options dialog also showcases the well-known jQuery dialogues, how they can be generated dynamically out of metadata. And of course, the user selection has to be honored, so saved somewhere. So take a look at this part of the code if you're interested in how to allow the end user, so to speak, to select and store the selections and use them in the functions, of course, that you execute. Okay, so that's the big function to create the menu. And of course, behind every menu item, and that's where our time ends here. That would take forever, really, but here's where you come in. So if you're interested in, okay, what exactly is going on, and I'm just picking randomly the service runner. So the business service dialog that lets you, well, load presets of previous runs or run a workflow, enter a business service name, enter a method, and run that business service. So business service simulator on steroids, basically. There is a demo in the first part, but let me give you a quick demo just to whet your appetite. So let's do something more advanced, like EI Siebel adapter. So you see there's a type ahead using jQuery, autocomplete in this case. So you can select EI Siebel adapter quickly. You can select the method real quick, like query page, and you get the properties. So there's what you really wanted the business service simulator to do for you all those years. And you can enter, you see the required property page size. So let's make it 10. And some of the fields like integration object selection is also autocomplete. So you can type ahead and find your integration object name really quick. And after a few clicks and moments, you're ready to run that business service and see the runtime and see the output. So that's the whole property set here. There's even a property set viewer. Doesn't work for this one. Yeah, too bad. It's experimental. Sometimes it works. And you can save this configuration. You can copy the property set. You can export eScript. So there's a lot of functionality just in this feature. Again, that would be to explain that as a whole. So now, how do you get to the source code? So you start with the menu and see, okay, there's something called service runner. So the easiest way is go into devpops.js and search for service runner, search for the text. So that's the actual dialog title. So there's one more, service runner. You look for label. Then you're inside the create debug menu function, and you have that menu entry. And look for the onClick property. And you see it just calls, well, it calls a function BCRM business service runner. And you go to that function. Well, and then you can knock yourself out and understand how the business service runner comes together. Okay, besides that, let's have a quick look at the CIF file that comes with devpops. So let me just briefly go to maybe to the Workspace dashboard, because I must have imported that recently. So yeah, main version 10 in my case is the CIF file import of devpops. So you can see several items here. Let's try to sort them. So let's briefly go here. So there are 3 applets and a view as well for the modified objects view that we have seen. We register business services with the application of choice. That's why Siebel Universal Agent is here. There are several business components supporting those integration objects, but also the modified objects view. Then there's business objects that support the data structure, integration objects, as we have mentioned already, of course, links as necessary, and you add the new view to a screen, and there's the view that comes with the CIF file. So any business service, of course, must be registered with the application so that it can be called from the browser script. And we also mentioned there's the client-side business service. So that's the FWK service. So you will find a lot of service calls if you search for FWK Runtime. For example, some functions in devpops can get and set system preferences. And that's, of course, something you have to do at the back end. So you need some business service method to do it. And the FWK Runtime Business Service contains all the necessary back-end methods, so to speak. So it's a central business service that the JavaScript code invokes very often. So you see 27 times. Look for get service, for example. That's where it's invoked. Different methods. For example, the SQL tracing and server manager integration, they all rely on this business service. And that business service is not in the repository, but it is a client-side business service. So technically speaking, it is in the administration business service screen. It has to import it, has to be imported. Let's find it. And let's drill down. Yeah, it has 30 methods. It's rather big. And if you find, of course, an invocation of this business service methods, which are sometimes very interesting, such as getting RR data, including Neo data, etc. So something that whets your appetite for sure. Then you can, of course, look at the, well, eScript implementation. And in this case, EI Siebel adapter is used with a, well, custom integration object and so forth. So I leave you with that because there's just no time in this 1 hour video that we could talk about each and every line of eScript code here. So as you investigate, so you continue on your own investigating the JavaScript, you will encounter calls to the FWK business service and the methods, and then you can see what the methods actually accomplish and what other repository objects they require. And you can go from there analyzing what happens. Okay, so that was hopefully some clarification on devpops, a sort of deep dive into the, well, dark corners of devpops. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Take care and bye-bye.